I've been a prisoner of war since December 19th, 1944, when our division was cut to ribbons by Hitler's last desperate thrust through Luxembourg and Belgium. We were shipped to a Dresden work camp on January 10th. On about February 14th, the Americans came over, followed by the RAF. Their combined labors destroyed all of Dresden, possibly the world's most beautiful city. But not me. I'm writing from a Red Cross club in the Le Havre POW repatriation camp. I can't receive mail here, so don't write. From a letter by PFC Kurt Vonnegut Jr. to his family, dated May 29th, 1945. The hero's journey is a theory outlined by Joseph Campbell in his seminal work of literary criticism, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It proposes a shape, a form which many heroic myths and legends from a myriad of differing cultures can fit into. Most of you probably learned this in high school if you were listening. The hero is identified, then they go into the world, find some friends, face a challenge, blah blah blah, and then they come back home having changed the world and themselves for the better. Other scholars identified the hero's journey before Campbell, but he helped to codify it, set it down into stone. He also had an affair with John Steinbeck's then wife, Carol. Funny little bit of history there. Him and Steinbeck were both writing books about Ed Ricketts, and while Steinbeck was finishing his novel, Campbell instead chose to finish with Carol. The most common way I've seen the hero's journey laid out is with a circle. And the shape does fit many stories quite well, but unfortunately, authors continue to try and tell new stories, stories which the circle might not fit. It's an interesting thought experiment. Can other shapes be ascribed to stories? And if so, what might those shapes look like? Lucky for us, Kurt Vonnegut took a stab at solving this riddle, saving the rest of us all that hard work. He graphed narratives along an altered XY axis, showing the ways they rise and fall with the fortunes of their central characters. The shapes, titled in ways like Man in Whole or Boy Meets Girl, can fit a wide number of stories, from Cinderella to Hamlet, and they typically end happily. Otherwise, of course, they don't sell well. What happens, though, if you want to work outside of the shapes, color outside the lines, connect the dots in the order of your choosing, rather than in some woke numerical order? Well, fortunately enough for you, Kurt Vonnegut has done some work on that front as well. If someone were to ask me to list my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut is not one of the first names that would come to mind. Other names, such as John Steinbeck's, James Baldwin's, Miko Kawakami's, or James Joyce's, those would come before him, as well as perhaps a few others. And yet I have now read Slaughterhouse-Five more times than I have read many books by those other authors. The second time I read it was 3 years ago, and this most recent time was the third time, and I was in high school when I first read it. Slaughterhouse-Five is a book about a man who experienced the firebombing of Dresden during World War II, written by a man who experienced the firebombing of Dresden during World War II. Both of these people, the author, Vonnegut, and the man, Billy Pilgrim, feature as characters in the novel, which is also not really about the firebombing of Dresden, an act that killed around 25,000 people. Vonnegut wrote Slaughterhouse-Five, but the book he wrote doesn't really seem to care for its author, a sentiment that was reflected in the writing of the book. In the opening chapter, Vonnegut reveals he has attempted to write the book for years, and only at the time of publishing, after these eons of toil, was he able to produce a, quote, short, jumbled, and jangled, end quote, mess of a book. The opening chapter also sets up this jumbled mess, with Vonnegut frantically hopping from topic to topic without much apparent concern for the reader's ability to keep up. Vonnegut as a narrator mostly vanishes after this first chapter. He reappears in the last pages of the novel, but his voice can be heard in the book's conversational style. Many passages begin with "listen" and end with "so it goes," the effect being to convince the reader that they are listening to an older coworker tell a story they've probably told a million times. The bulk of the work is occupied with a man called Billy Pilgrim. Now, the only notable thing about Billy is his penis size. Exceptionally large. In case you don't know the plot of Slaughterhouse-Five, a rough summary is as follows. Pilgrim's life story, his marriage to a wife he doesn't really love, his time spent as a POW in World War II, his unhappy childhood, and the manner of his death are all recounted completely out of order. This is because Billy Pilgrim is unstuck in time. This is a result of his capture by aliens known as Tralfamadorians, who bring him through a time portal to their planet where they place him in a zoo alongside a porn star named Montana Wildhack. A surprisingly small amount of time in this already small book is spent on Billy's life in the zoo. Most of the book is spent with Billy in Germany. He is captured by the Nazis, given a coat that is too small, which has a diamond in the lining, is kept in a hospital, sent to Dresden, and forced to perform menial labor until he hides in a meat locker with other Americans to survive the bombs which turned Dresden into, quote, the surface of the moon. As you might imagine, Billy's story doesn't really have a shape. Even if it were to be laid out in chronological order, the peaks and the valleys he experiences don't slide neatly into any story archetype, least of all a hero's circle. And before you all start asking me silly little questions about what it's about, it's an anti war novel. Okay? War is bad. I think most of us understand that. But for the few that don't, there you go. Settled? Good. Now I can talk about what I really want to talk about. Slaughterhouse-Five describes wanton violence, brutality beyond belief. It was born out of a desire to make sense of the violence, and in its earliest forms it probably tried to. However, in its published form, it eschews finding meaning, instead choosing merely to describe, often with fairly basic language. A woman is, for example, described as a, quote, bitchy flibbertigibbet, end quote, one of many less than flattering ways in which women are addressed in this novel. Now, beyond being a misogynist, Vonnegut was also a humanist. He believed in human beings, no matter how hard they tried to knock that belief out of him. This is the central conflict in many of Vonnegut's books, but especially in Slaughterhouse-Five. How can one go on living and believing in people when all the bad they are capable of is so much easier to see? Billy sees death all around him. His friends die, the Nazis die, German citizens die, his colleagues post-war die, his wife dies, and he dies. At some point, life becomes a death parade. All of your loves die while you wait to die, and the world dies around you. It doesn't make sense. On a fundamental level, it is near impossible to reconcile. It doesn't fit any one explanation. It defies shape. How do you make sense of the bombs turning houses to dust, human beings to paste? How do you keep going after that? Well, you don't make it make sense. You write a story without a shape, because there is no shape to a life like that. Tralfamadorians, the aliens who kidnap Billy, they see all of time at once. This is best illustrated by how they view stars, not as fixed points of light, but as strands of luminous spaghetti crisscrossing the heavens, all the places a star has ever been or will ever be. Death is a point to the Tralfamadorians, but it's not an end. Billy dies a little after the halfway point of Slaughterhouse-Five. The novel continues for a while after this, though, because what defines Billy Pilgrim is not his way of death, but rather his embrace of the Tralfamadorian viewpoint. He experiences death for a while, and then he swings back into life again. This is perhaps the most useful way to illustrate the reason behind the nonlinear narrative's lack of shape. It does not ping-pong between good and bad fortune, nor indeed follow Billy from a point in his life until his death. It shows the parts which matter and a few that don't. Bad in people, and, more importantly, the good. If one were to plot the book on one of Vonnegut's graphs, it would be incomprehensible. It would be tangles here, Morse code there, and perhaps at one point an upward curve disappearing beyond the reaches of the axis. Why would you write a story without a shape? Because humans don't have shapes. We are spaghetti holding together a meat sauce, bolognese with a pilot. What logical shape is there for a human being which can bomb their fellow man to pieces and, in the same breath, have a kitchen and a theater set up in the middle of a POW camp, stacked with veritable tons of goods? What would that shape even be called? A triangle? Polygon? Even? Obviously, there is no shape. Not for humans, not for this planet. We are capable of heaven and hell. Vonnegut thought so. I think he probably tried to shake the humanism his whole life. He tried to get out from under it and forget that last little bit of hope, the only bit the bombings left him with. But he was unable to do so. The geezer just couldn't help himself. In Vonnegut's mind, life is viewed not as a start and a stop, but as a journey wholesale. The way you cross the heavens is the point. Quick side note. Slaughterhouse-Five is not a perfect book. In addition to the aforementioned misogyny, Vonnegut also uses staggeringly inaccurate numbers when it comes to the death toll in Dresden. This is forgivable because they were the best numbers available at the time of writing his novel, but they did come from a neo-Nazi, so, you know. There's also a critique that the work has a frankly lazy point of view, the quietest point of view, which, from what I can tell, essentially advocates for not trying at all. Additionally, the prose is so simple and the novel so wildly unstructured, it could be difficult for a reader to connect with it on any deeper level than laughing at lines like, quote, "go take a flying fuck at a rolling donut." Now, I'm not bringing up the flaws of the novel with the intention of refuting them. I think the successes of the novel far outweigh its flaws, but I figured they were worth addressing in some way. I also don't think the novel would be what it is without being flawed. Now, it's a book that celebrates life as much as it criticizes it, and life cannot and should not be perfect. Now, should life be good? Should we all be able to love ourselves and our place in the world despite the hurt it keeps throwing our way? No, not without my express approval and permission. You have to answer to me! Let's talk about the ending now. Slaughterhouse-Five ends in a graveyard. Dresden has become a tomb. There's so many bodies hidden underneath the wreckage of the buildings that digging them up becomes an impossible task. Bodies begin to rot, and the smell is so bad a POW who does the digging legitimately pukes himself to death. It's a grim fucking scene. The bodies are then, for logistical reasons, burnt wherever they are encountered. Billy and the other prisoners dig until one day they do not. The war has ended. It's springtime and birdsong can be heard on the air. Billy, who will live on and die and will always live on and will always die, sees beauty in the place where he has seen so much carnage. The last passage goes like this. And somewhere in there was springtime. The Thorpe's mines were closed down. The soldiers all left to fight the Russians. Billy and the rest of his group were locked up in the stable in the suburbs. And then, one morning, they got up to discover that the door was unlocked. World War II in Europe was over. Billy and the rest wandered out into the shady street. Trees were leafing out. There was nothing going on out there, no traffic of any kind. There was only one vehicle, an abandoned wagon drawn by two horses. The wagon was green and coffin-shaped. Birds were talking. One bird said to Billy Pilgrim, "Hoot-tweet!" Was Vonnegut a perfect guy? Don't be ridiculous, of course not. Did he manage to write a perfect book? If so, I have yet to read it. He was, however, deeply human, flawed in the same ways that many of us are flawed, hurt in the ways that we're hurt, and perhaps most importantly, he found a reason to keep going, in the way we all must. The beauty is in the fuck-ups, and the beauty is in the beauty. It's the inherent paradox of the human condition, and Vonnegut captures it to a T in the book that is described as his masterwork. I will probably return to Slaughterhouse-Five again, years from now, when I need a little help to keep believing in the good. I'm not sure it will help me then, but it did help me a little this most recent time around. There's a quote in the middle of the book that is displayed on a drawing of a tombstone. It's in the middle of a passage describing Billy's wedding night, and this is what it says. Everything was beautiful, and nothing hurt. It's obviously a lie, but in a way it's also true. Everything was beautiful. Now, there was hurt too, which made things ugly, but the hurt gives way to the beauty. It doesn't make sense, but there it is. One cannot exist without the other. So it goes.